Okay, this is very exciting. We're getting close to the end of this course or series of sessions, which I found them very helpful and encouraging to think about these topics. So I hope you have as well. I'm very excited about tonight's discussion. I think it's a really interesting problem and very much also speaks to us today in our current circumstances. So, Amanda, I'm delighted to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Welcome back. Again, it's so wonderful to have you, especially those of you who have been persevering with us throughout all of the virtues of resistance. Of course, each session is standalone, so even if you are welcome back, you haven't missed a beat, and we're happy to have you as well. Nicole and I just wrapped up a phenomenal Canadian Physicians for Life bioethics symposium on mental health, and a couple of you joining us here were also here with us in Calgary. That was amazing to have you in person, to be together again. And yeah, so and I recognize other names again from those who I've seen in other parts of the country. So great to have you here. And we're going to dive right in to this session on a strange patriotism. And this title is taken from the quotation upon which I came at the German Resistance Memorial Museum that I visited in Berlin. I came across a quotation by the woman, Ruth Andreas-Friedrich, who appears in our article. And this quotation is very near to the entrance of the German Resistance Memorial Museum, and it says, "The final victory, when the Allies marched through the Brandenburg Gate, and once again I think, as so often, what an absurdity for a German to pray for the enemy's victory. A strange patriotism that can wish for nothing better than the conquering of one's own country." So that is the source for the title of this session, a strange patriotism that can wish for nothing better than the conquering of one's own country. Throughout this course, we're looking at all forms of resistance, all manner of resistance, the small deeds, the more dramatic deeds, the non-participation, the intense participation, like we saw last week with the uh, dissident who wore a Nazi uniform but was trying his utmost to resist and to warn the world about what was happening. So now we have this snapshot of a group, and before we had looked at the White Rose Resistance, a Christian student group. This group is different, much more informal, much more grassroots, much less religiously motivated. And this group informally was known as Uncle Emil. This was the name of the resistance circle. And there were key figures in it who had some kind of loose position of leadership. But as we see throughout this article, this kind of group was resisting through the most simple, ordinary acts that they knew. And as the New York Times columnist points out, resisting in ways that didn't necessarily cost them their lives. And so I'm just going to highlight a few things from this very interesting, detailed article called Saving Konrad Latte by Peter Schneider from the New York Times. I'll pick a few sections that struck me since it's quite a long article, but then, of course, during our discussion, we'll have time to go deeper and especially to consider together what this brings to bear on our own situation. So I found it immensely interesting that the article starts off by saying that there are, among the many memorials recalling the persecution and destruction of Berlin's Jews, not one honors the Berliners who hid and protected the fugitives from Nazism. And then goes on to discuss how many times people must have been saved by good German neighbors if they were Jews who survived life in Berlin during the war. Then he talks about how Konrad Latte, the man who is featured in this piece, could name 50 different protectors during the war. This is immensely interesting. And yet, as he goes out on, and I really appreciate his kind of journalistic reflection here, people didn't want to hear these stories, especially in Germany. you would immediately come under suspicion of trying to whitewash Germany's past. And he describes how in the 60s he didn't want to write a piece like this because it was much too taboo to focus on German rescuers. No way was that going to be seen as appropriate or fitting. And yet now I think it's quite fitting, quite necessary. And he says on the first page, we don't need to know the number in order to pay homage to this untypical, admirable minority. And while every German teenager has heard about the mass murderers, Hitler, Goebbels, Eichmann, and Mengele, they don't know about the Germans who sheltered and saved the persecuted. And I've mentioned before in this series that when I traveled with Holocaust survivors, in particular, survivor Fegi Libman told me that she never speaks about her story. She never goes to schools and talks without mentioning the righteous among the nations. Without mentioning the righteous, she says the future generations will be lost. They'll lack an orientation and that we need heroes. So I very much like this section as well because the heroism is not as dramatic as the martyrdom of Maximilian Kolbe or not as high stakes as some of the others. But what his story shows, what his profile shows, is, as he says, a contradiction of the self-justifying myth that the Nazi terror machine was so finely tuned that obedience was the only option, because there are cases where people could resist without automatically risking their life. They didn't necessarily know that they wouldn't be risking their life, but not everything was life-threatening. So that's quite interesting. Even in the worst years of state terror, there was a choice, a small choice, and some people made that choice. When he talks about Konrad Latte, like many, Konrad did not want to speak about these things until much, much later in life. He had a kind of survivor guilt, and I think this is a theme we haven't necessarily touched on previously, but I want to, in this session, discuss a little bit, while we're discussing the virtues of resistance, there's also uh, some real counter points to these virtues. In particular, that woman whose quotation I read about a strange patriotism, Ruth Andreas-Friedrich, I read about her. I read about her after the war, and actually, as soon as I had read that quotation, I wanted to find out all about her and a little bit more of her life story. And I found out that she wrote some books after the war, and that in 1948 she moved to Munich and she got married and with another resistance figure. And then it says that she died by suicide in Munich at the age of 75 and that she was honored posthumously by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations in 2002. So, interesting when we consider the teaching of heroes. What difference does it make if our heroic ethical exemplar, on the one hand, as a resistance figure in Germany, then chooses to die by suicide? Does it affect our capacity to extol, particularly for kind of Holocaust education purposes, such resistance figures? But we can kind of come up back to that, I would say, in the discussion. So throughout this piece, we have a lot of instances of ways in which this particular individual, Konrad Latte, was saved. And I didn't do it myself, but I was thinking at the end it would be neat to underline, or as a maybe student reading exercise, how many instances are detailed that he recalls of the specific ways that he was saved, moved from houses, kept hidden, things like this. And um, I'm just going to come quickly to the conclusion of the article, and then we can discuss its contents more together. Um, Toward the end, the journalist mentions that the righteous people in Latte's story, this is the bottom of page 16, came from all walks of life. Pensioners and musicians, superintendents and nurses, prominent conductors, writers, clerics, religiously inspired individuals, and atheists. So we can also consider how could people be motivated to resistance with no faith, with no tradition, just by their being a good neighbor, because we've had lots of accounts of people motivated by their Jehovah Witness tradition or by their Christian faith, but here we have a lot of secular people. And we have on page 17, other survivor stories involve different types of rescuers, factory workers, victory gardeners, prostitutes. They were by and large not organized, but many of them knew one another and belonged to circles of friends who ultimately developed conspiratorial solutions to individual practical problems. Not all responded from purely humanitarian motives. Some demanded money, jewelry, or price in the form of religious, political, or sexual tribute, but most of them sharing a loathing for Hitler's regime and a reluctance to leave a fugitive begging for help at the door. In comparison with the number who shared in committing the crime of the Holocaust or who simply let it happen, the 50 righteous souls who helped Latte were a tiny band, but even if they were only 40 or 30 or 10, those of us who have come after them need to tell their stories and to build on them. In the end, it isn't the justly admired. In the end, it isn't the justly admired, death-defying resistance figures who decide whether a society will succumb to totalitarianism. The success of a dictatorship, like the success of the resistance to it, depends not on a few great leaders, but upon the civic virtue of the average citizen. Bertolt Brecht's too often quoted warning, "Unhappy the land that needs heroes," cries out for revision. In a society of conformists and cowards, the courage of a few death-defying heroes redeems no one. So we can also discuss some of those conclusions. What is the role for heroes? How do we study ethical exemplars? How important is it that the life of the exemplars to whom we look is comprehensively virtuous rather than perhaps just anecdotal virtues under pressure or in a tough moment. So there's a lot here, but I really propose it to us because I think it's interesting to consider how many times would our resistance cost us less than we expect, and yet we are fearful. And how many different forms of resistance can there be in a dispersed, disaggregated way that then adds up and compounds into a kind of civic virtue that we can then speak about an Uncle Emil group or a form of resistance by neighborly Germans with civic virtue. So with that, we're gonna delve into our discussion together.